What I'd like to do now is just give you an overview of what the general structure of this program is and how I'm going to discuss this very broad topic of sleep in the brain. All right, so you can see that we've divided this program into 4 primary sections, and each of the sections has a very specific purpose or goal. And the National Sleep Foundation, as you may know, is a government-sponsored organization of esteemed sleep researchers who are dedicated to promoting the importance of sleep for health. And many of the statistics that we get about sleep in America actually come from the National Sleep Foundation. And I had always assumed that it had been something that had been around for years, and yet it was only founded in 1990. In 1992, our first class of FDA-approved non-benzodiazepine medications for sleep were approved. And among the first, some of you may know, was Ambien or Zolpidem. And again, that was not until 1992. That was actually a time when I was actually in medical school. And then coming around 1997, 1999, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine was established. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't until last year where the first medication for sleep that works by a novel mechanism was introduced. Again, this is suvorexant or Belsomra, which is something that we're going to learn about later on. So from that brief outline of some of the milestones, you can appreciate my point that much of what we know about sleep has only come about in the last 50 years or so. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward then and begin to tackle some basic statistics about sleep. So again, many of these statistics come from the National Sleep Foundation, and among the main findings from the most recent surveys is that about 45% of Americans say that sleep has affected their daily activities at least once in the past 7 days. I should emphasize poor sleep or inadequate sleep. That's once in the past 7 days where we've been affected by sleep. So that's quite an astounding statistic when you think about it. Almost half of us have impairments in our functioning as a result of a lack of sleep. And of course, there are other statistics or other ways of breaking this down. And what I think is important to know is that we always have to be mindful of how such data is accumulated. Now, shortcomings, one of the possible criticisms of data like this is that much of the sleep data is coming from polls and self-reports. And if any of you know about studies, you probably know that polls or self-reports are among the worst type of evidence you can get, right? Because we, as Americans, and generally, we can be notoriously inaccurate at reporting the amount of sleep that we get. So, the gold standard for really assessing this is to actually take someone in a sleep lab and actually use sophisticated instruments to measure both the quality as well as the quantity of their sleep. So this in any event is some of the data that's coming out to us from the National Sleep Foundation. Now, here's some other interesting findings, is that Americans spend an average of about 7.5 hours of night per sleep, again, according to self-report. But here again, as I looked through various sources, I found that this isn't always clear. There's not always an agreement about this number. I came upon other data, for example, that suggested that the average American is sleeping much less than 7.5 hours per night. One study I came upon suggested that in some parts of America, we're sleeping as little as 6 hours per night on average. So other studies suggest that's not the case. We're pretty much getting as much sleep as we did, say, even 20 years ago. Another interesting finding about sleep is that most of us, about a third of us, not most of us, but about a third of us report that our quality of sleep is poor or only fair, which again is quite a significant amount. That's 1/3 of us who would claim that we have some problem with our sleep. Related statistic is that about 67% of those with less than good sleep also report poor or fair health. I mentioned earlier that there's still a lot of information about sleep in the brain that we don't know about, and that much of this information has only come down to us in the last 30 or 40 years. Well, just a few years ago, another interesting finding that has to do with sleep and immunity was made, and that was a discovery of what's now known as the glymphatic system, a system of cleansing the brain at night that we had no idea existed until researchers described it.